Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The Grand Prix weekend that many expected before the season would be the most critical for championship success has now officially arrived. We're in Spanish Grand Prix race week, the week where the technical directive affecting the rear wing flexibility is going to come into effect. The rear wings that these teams have used, certainly the front runners from now until this point in the season, will literally be thrown away. That is certainly the case for what we think. Ferrari, McLaren as well though are the big conversation topic. Red Bull are pretty convinced this should slow McLaren down, and if it does, with Verstappen still in striking distance after Monaco, we could have a very different championship on our hands. What's actually going to happen when we get to Barcelona in a couple of days? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. The first bit of controversy was actually about this graphic here that F1 put together for the race, because we've got Fernando Alonso, we've got Carlos Sainz, a couple of Spaniards, then we've got Franco Colapinto, right, who's not... Okay, he speaks Spanish, but he's not Spanish. Look, does it really matter? No, but I know that people were talking about it and saying they should have put somebody else on here instead, like why is Colapinto there? At the end of the day, all the drivers get, their time on these graphics at some point, so maybe they just threw him on there. I don't know. I don't really think it's a big deal, but, this is Formula 1, baby. People talk about anything and everything. Monaco is continually a discussion after yesterday because it was a more interesting weekend. It was a slightly more compelling weekend than normal because of the mandated two-stop. But, as expected, we got some interesting strategies, and those strategies generally involved just holding up the entire pack so you can let your teammate in front of you build a pit stop gap and then pit and then come out for free, swap the cars and do the same thing again. That was the Williams strategy. That's what frustrated Mercedes, and Russell said, look, I'm going to have dinner with Alex and he's going to foot the bill, which is exactly what happened a few hours later. So, thought it was all rather funny. Can't imagine it was especially cheap over there in Monaco. But Russell had some other ideas. Like, what do we do with Monaco? This is the fundamental question. Look, could we change the track? Possibly. There's a couple of options that people have considered. The main one being on the entrance to the tunnel. There's the right-hander before the tunnel. It's actually possible to go left there, go round a roundabout, and then basically have a higher speed going into the tunnel because you give yourself some extra time to get up to speed. You could make it a DRS zone. But look, the tunnel... it's already kind of dangerous sometimes. Adding extra speed and maybe DRS to it would cause, issues. And of course, let's not forget, by the way, DRS goes next year anyway, so that actually isn't even a conversation. However, there are changes to next year's cars. They go from high downforce mode to low downforce mode using the active aerodynamics they're introducing. There's going to be differences in the power unit deployment, we think, next year. So maybe Monaco won't be as bad anyway. They don't want to change the track. They really don't. It might be something that needs considering because Russell even said... you could have put an F2 car out there and he might have been able to hold up some Formula 1 cars for a decent amount of time. Like, you can drive 4, 5, 6 seconds off the pace and there's just nothing that the guy behind can even think to do about it. So Russell says, look, maybe you add a sprinkler, you like the Bernie Eccleston idea, spices things up a bit. Christian Horner says that really, you've got to make circuit changes if you want to change the Grand Prix because the issues that we are seeing and will frankly continue to see, whether it's a mandated one-stop or two-stop or whatever, because you can just drive so far off the pace and hold up the car behind, it opens the door to this potential manipulation, as Carlos Sainz described it, and says, look, the two-stop didn't change anything. The sport should look at a way where manipulating the race outcome with the pace shouldn't be allowed. So what do you do about that? Is it possible to do so? We know that in qualifying there's a rule called the 107% rule, which is never used nowadays. But effectively it meant that if you qualified outside of 107% of the pole times, if you were more than 7% off the pace of the leader, then you would be excluded. And that rule, was enforced because there used to be a big delta between the cars. Nowadays, that's not so true. But in the race, could you have something similar to say that, you can't just deliberately lap so much slower than... I don't know. It would be so difficult to implement, though, because how do you do it? Do you say, okay, you're not allowed to lap less than 107% of your teammates' pace? What becomes an appropriate figure? What if it rains? All these other factors, like what if you make a mistake on the lap or you get blue flags, you have to let somebody by, it costs you a bit of time. It just doesn't really work. You can't really do it. And also, okay, let's say you're only allowed to be within 3 seconds a lap or of your teammate's pace at the time or somebody else in a similar tyre compound. Like, there's so much complexity to the situation. And even if that was to be a potential rule, you know, they would still just drive within the limits of it and would say, okay, well, instead of building a pit stop gap in 4 or 5 laps, I can build it over 10, 11 laps, right? It's going to be the same old story. So the fundamental issue of the no overtaking at Monaco leads to these dramas. You know, was it more interesting and compelling given the 2-stop? Probably yes, from a fan perspective, watching from home. Williams and James Vowles even apologised to Toto Wolff and Mercedes and said, look, I didn't want to go racing like this, but that's what we had to do. And Merc, let's not, you know, put it lightly, they would have done exactly the same thing had it been the other way around. They even had their plans to potentially try and win the race. The big drama from Russell was that he cut the chicane, overtook, ate the penalty, and it actually worked out for him, which is funny because he was able to overtake. Antonelli was able to then himself create a couple of pit stop gaps behind that gave Russell the possibility to actually finish further up than he would have done. Still no points, but it is, yeah, an interesting situation where even though he got a drive-through penalty, it was actually still in his best interests to literally cut the chicane, take the hit, and, well, enjoy the race as well, is what Russell said. That he was like, I'm not going to get points anyway, I might as well actually enjoy myself here. And he actually finished better as a result, which was, yeah, pretty, well, very, very interesting, actually. So this race, George Russell actually did something. Of course, that's the meme, isn't it? That, you know, does nothing, gets P3. This race, he did something and got a drive-through penalty. Now, this had 500 votes on it. I guess I'll just refresh to see what the current numbers are looking like. Whether you like, it's basically the same, whether you like or dislike the Monaco 2-stop. I voted like it, which I think is a bit of a controversial one, obviously, based on the reaction here. I think I would prefer something else to be mandated, because it does make things interesting. The reality is now, we kind of know what the strategy would be next year, and the teams will try and qualify their drivers close to each other, and then they can pull the same thing that everyone has done. So I think the 2-stop rule is better, and Christian Horner said it, that he thinks the race is more interesting, there was more jeopardy, there was more going on, and I'd be inclined to agree. So would I axe the 2-stop rule and go back to where we were? Probably not. I think I would keep it, but I think I would consider doing other things as well. But yeah, look, it wasn't great, was it? Let's be real, it's not changed Monaco dramatically. A couple of other interesting updates. Isaac Hadjar got his best result of the season, P6 finish for him, and the thing is that Liam Lawson had a pretty good weekend, all things considered. You know, qualified reasonably well, finally scored some points, started 9th, finished 8th, played the team game well, but again was massively overshadowed by Isaac Hadjar, right? And this is just continues to be incredibly impressive. He is, I think, well, not even I think, he is just for sure the surprise package of the season. There's no doubt about that Hadjar has overperformed expectations in my eyes more than any other driver has. And that is a great sign for his future, although you might argue that it's not, because he might get the Red Bull second seat at some point, which is maybe not where you want to be. I will also mention, Ferrari continue to absolutely crush it in the Pit Stop World Championship here. The fastest pit stops in Monaco. Max had a 2.27, pretty quick. Norris, 2.23, pretty quick. McLaren, 2.31 with Piastri. Antonelli, even the Saubers, they finally figured out their issues, you guys, I'm sure, remember the start of last season. But the quickest was Leclerc with a 2 flat, and even Hamilton had a 2.08 stop. So honestly, unreal from Ferrari that they're putting together this type of championship challenge in the pit stop championships, right? But look at this, the fastest pit stops of the year. We've got a couple at 2 flat for Leclerc. We've got an 04 and 05, and we've got Hamilton with an 07 and an 08. So, you know, all just, I mean, incredibly impressive. Red Bull, their fastest one was with Yuki at a 2.09. Racing Bulls did a 2.08 in China with Yuki. But the fastest 6 of the entire season are Ferrari pit stops, which is, yeah, great on some level, and I think Fred Vasseur and the team deserve some credit for actually improving their operations in this regard, but they need to do more where that came from. And especially because the championship for Ferrari is maybe surprisingly somewhat still alive. I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago I had people saying that Williams were going to beat Ferrari in the Constructors. I was like, you know, just hold your horses a second. Like, it's still early days. And also, Ferrari are bringing more upgrades than Williams are. So, like, there was never a way that Williams were going to beat them in the Constructors, let's be real. And that's becoming increasingly clear. Racing Bulls move up into 7th with their victory. Well, not victory, but the victory over some of their rivals, for sure. They get 22 points now. They've overtaken Aston Martin. Alpine at 7, Kick Sauber at 6, Hasser at 26 still. Williams kind of in a bit of a no man's land in 5th. And they're probably not going to be able to... Well, I don't reckon they're going to go up or down all that far. McLaren are absolutely dominating proceedings. They're at 319 already. That championship has long been done. But the race for seconds kind of out of nowhere, is now back on. It felt like for some time Mercedes were going to be the key challenger. It felt like for a little bit of time that maybe Russell was going to be the man outside of Verstappen to actually challenge for the championship. The constructors for Mercedes was always going to be too much to ask for. But here they are, with only 147 points. Max has scored the vast majority of Red Bull's points, and this is effectively just the Max Verstappen number. And then Ferrari at 142. And look, we're expecting Spain to potentially change the tide of this battle rather a lot. But right now it's all to play for. I think Ferrari are still the weakest of these four teams, and obviously the numbers play that out. And that's what we see here. But nonetheless, I mean, look, if they hadn't been double disqualified back in China, they would have been second by a decent margin right now. But of course, that's not how it turned out. They've had a few decent Grand Prix as of late, Ferrari, but converting that into a victory and, you know, trying to fix their rear suspension and some of the issues they're still facing, that is still a very tall order. But around Monaco, it was certainly better than they expected. Again, it's a very unique circuit. They could set their car up just fully for low-speed corners and high downforce mode, and that seems to work. Some cars have lots of compromise, where if you want to be good in the low speed, you've got to sacrifice elsewhere. And that seems to be where Ferrari currently are. These are the driver standings. Piastri still leads by 3 points. Lando gets his first victory since Melbourne, the first race of the season, and at a very opportune time at that. He's now 3 points behind. Verstappen is 22 points behind Lando, and therefore 25 points, a race win behind Piastri. Russell's falling away. Leclerc and Hamilton will feel optimistic that they can maybe leapfrog Russell at some point, but you know, who knows? It's been a couple of difficult Grand Prix for Mercedes, but I'd still expect them to be back on certain tracks this season. They'll still be very competitive, and maybe Ferrari have had a couple of good circuits. We go to Spain, where I'm certainly expecting Merc to be better, but you know, we'll see, because, like, as you guys know, I actually really like the Barcelona track. I know that it's a hot take, but I always love this Grand Prix. I'm looking forward to it this upcoming weekend as well, and for more reasons than just because I find the track entertaining to watch for qualifying in the race, mainly because of the updates and upgrades to this weekend's Spanish Grand Prix. So first of all, teams are bringing upgrades out the wazoo, right? They're changing everything. Loads of teams are bringing major changes to this weekend's race. Monaco teams will bring circuit-specific things, as they did, but typically nothing which is going to be too dramatic, because if you change too much in Monaco, it's just a weird track, isn't it, right? You'd prefer to get the data in Imola or in Spain. Now, some teams brought many things to Imola, as did, for example, Red Bull. That seemed to work, and likely will help them in Spain as well. But in Spain, we're seeing various teams make changes. The major change, though, is the new technical directive. So this was announced before the season even started, that at the 9th Grand Prix of the season, the FIA, they messed around with it. They said, no, we're not going to do anything, and then they changed their mind and actually said, no, okay, we will do something about the flexible wings, because Red Bull in the off-season were like, okay, FIA, these wings are clearly flexing more front and rear than they should be based on your rules, so, you know, what are we going to do about it? And the FIA said, well, you know, it's the final year of the regs, we probably won't do anything if they technically pass the tests, even if they're flexing more in reality. Basically, because if you're doing a static load test, there's only so much weight you can put on the car, and there's only so much weight you can put on the car in certain sections. The actual force that the elements go through at high speed, you know, given the airflow and stuff, and the effectively wings upside down, generating downforce, they can flex more there than they will do in a static load test, because they're experiencing more force. And if you effectively design the aero elasticity in such a way that it will flex more at certain levels of loads than it will do when it's getting tested, then you can gain an advantage. And the big advantage really being that, you know, a lot of these cars, given the natural design of these regulations, can suffer with, in the high-speed corners, some oversteer, and in the kind of medium-speed corners, entry understeer, because the boat to cars nowadays is a bit of an issue. Now, obviously, it depends on the team and everything, but the front wings especially, if they effectively subside at high speed, and even at, you know, medium speed corners and stuff like this, and then flick back into place, especially for the lower speed stuff, it tends to give the cars much more preferable balance, and that means they can set the car up in the way that they want to, and the drivers are generally slightly happier. But the technical directive is coming into place. The wings now, mainly the front wing, but the rear wing I think this also applies to. We're not talking anymore about mini DRS either. That conversation has kind of been parked for now. McLaren admitted, okay, we won't do it anymore. It's more about how much the front wing is actually flexing under high speed, You guys can see here, for example, the level of these wing flap angles when the McLaren is at 80 kph compared to when it's at 325 kph. You'll see this wing has flexed substantially into a different position. Now, this is going to change. So the load tests that are currently done, where they place a load, pretty heavy one, but not as heavy as the actual air force generates during a Grand Prix or qualifying or whatever, they have placed them on the car and they're fine. But they will change the rules so that they are far more stringent and they are not able to flex anywhere near enough. Now, are the teams going to be incredibly clever and say, okay, we'll design a new wing that compromises so it actually passes the load test but still is able to deflect at some of the higher loads? I think the answer to that question is yes. The teams will figure out ways to pass the test and still do as much as they can with the flexibility of the wings because it gives them major advantages. Because it means they have to make fewer compromises with the setup of their car when they have the flexibility to play with. I think the teams will figure out a way, maybe not immediately, but they probably will, to allow their wings to still flex quite a lot even with these new regulations. But they are going to clamp down on them a lot, and at least for the medium term and the immediate term, it's difficult to imagine that this isn't going to affect the teams to some great degree. I mean, there was also this clip kind of happening during the Grand Prix in Imola where, over the curbing here, maybe you can see that McLaren front wing is bouncing all over the shop. I mean, look, I don't know. The Mercedes is also very much guilty of this, right? Like, the two teams that really are getting implicated a lot, I mean, really there's three teams, and even Alpine and Haas and stuff have been playing around with it. But of the four teams we mentioned, the one that doesn't seem to be doing it as much is Red Bull Racing. And that is the question, because Mercedes, their front wing is very flexible, McLaren is true as well, and Ferrari did a good job introducing their own version last year. Red Bull spent the off-season definitely committing resources and time to making it work, but they were speaking with the FIA saying that we need to change this, and they've got their will. They are changing it. As Giuliana here says, Rosario Giuliana from Auto Racer, these are the front wings of the Ferrari, and these will be parked. These are never going to be used again. I mean, it'd be nice to have one to hang up on the wall, but these are not going to be used ever again. And yeah, as he says, we can consider them to be thrown away. In Spain, they change. So these front wing designs that you see here for Ferrari and for the other teams will not be the same front wings the teams will bring to Spain, because these will not comply to the new technical directives, and that is likely true for pretty much all of the top teams. So Red Bull are very optimistic. This is going to hurt McLaren. At the end of the day, the battle for the World Championship in the Constructors is not really on. Even if it hurts McLaren a lot, McLaren are still winning this year's Constructors. The big question is whether this is enough for Max to win the title. I think Spain will give us a very strong idea as to that. If it's business as usual, then it's business as usual. But if Verstappen is more competitive, if the McLaren seems to be worse to some degree, I'm hoping that it works out in such a way that it feels like we have a championship. Because if McLaren fall off dramatically and Verstappen wins by a mile, then it's probably Max's championship very much so to lose at that point. But if it goes slightly differently, which I think it probably will, I'm just hoping that things remain very competitive after these changes. Because, if it stays how it is right now and the competitive order stays as it is presently, Max isn't going to win the title. So I think he needs this, and Red Bull need this to give themselves a chance. But, it may go too far one way or the other. My thinking is it probably should affect McLaren to some degree, and I think Mercedes as well, because we know that they've been using it a lot. Ferrari also, it's true, but my gut feel is it won't hurt them as much if it does hurt the other teams, and Ferrari themselves seem pretty confident about that fact as well. Red Bull are the most optimistic with Verstappen, but it's not like things don't affect them entirely either. It's merely that they've put together a car that doesn't suffer from these issues as much. But yeah, very much interested your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. McLaren's 6th double podium of the season in Monaco. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.